Welcome to the panel on Companies Calling, Leveraging Corporate Leadership on Beneficial Ownership Transparency. I'm Hodess. I'm with the B Team. The B Team is a 10-year-old initiative of business and civil society. We were set up by business and civil society leaders who wanted to promote shared well-being on a healthy planet, to work toward an inclusive economy, and to do that by encouraging business to be at the tip of the spear in terms of their actions and commitments and public voice on issues broadly relating to environment and climate, to social issues, human rights, and also to the G, to governance. Another thing that we work at on the B Team is leadership change, and I think that's a very relevant topic for today because we all need to be leaders when agendas and issues are difficult, and working on ambition for leadership is another aspect of our work. Maybe just a word on the G that we work on the governance piece. As most of you in the room will probably support, governance issues really underlie both public and private sector efforts to build accountability, to create a virtuous circle from disclosure to build trust and fairness, and to build an accountability loop that helps bring effectiveness in practice, whether it's public or private affairs. It brings more equality and equity, and it brings profits based on a basis of fairness rather than opacity and corruption. So I think the G issue is not only itself important as we talk about transparency, but it's an underlying issue, and it's one I know that many of us are here at this conference because of. And beneficial ownership transparency is a key reform in the governance space that many of us have worked on for a long time. And I think it gave us all a sense of ambition and also optimism because it was a solution. When you work on anti-corruption, there's a lot of delving into the roots of the problem and so on. And here with a beneficial ownership approach, we had something we could do. And I wanted to think back to when we began work on this agenda, and I was reflecting, and from the civil society point of view, where my own roots are, I remembered an effort we made, and it must be about 15 years ago, to work on a politically exposed persons register. And I also recall some of the similarities of that work to this work, and that's why I mention it. I mean, at the time, I think we were looking for a way for civil society to get involved in efforts to address issues around illicit financial flows, to look at the interests behind business. And we saw that some countries had PEP lists, and they weren't really adequate, and they weren't necessarily even complete. And we thought, well, what can civil society do? And this idea of a PEP register came out of that effort a long time ago. And that was an era when, WikiLeaks and investigative journalism and so on were nascent, let's say, not the kind of established role that they have now. And so I think we were part of that discussion early on. And another interesting sort of legacy of that was this focus on building a register and why and how civil society could crowdsource information and also push to build a register. Well, we didn't get funding for that project, and there were some good reasons why, and that's the subject for, I guess, a glass of wine. But I think what went on from that time was a real interest in how civil society could join forces with others who are interested in tracing and tracking the money, following the money, making sure we prevented illicit financial flows, understood the interests behind business, prevented corruption, and allowed legitimate businesses to do business with legitimate partners. And for all those reasons, about 15 years ago, work on this issue of beneficial ownership emerged. Fast forward, and the B Team has been working on this agenda for about 10 years, and even before I joined. And I think what is so interesting is it's really part of a trifecta of transparency tools: ownership transparency, contract transparency, and tax transparency. And there are sectors like oil, gas, and mining where that is self-evident and quite advanced, and there are other sectors where that doesn't seem so obvious, a combination of transparency measures. But For certain, there are a lot of us who have worked long on that agenda. There are many successes, and there are many alliances that have been built. So before we talk about some of the challenges again today, I just want to recognize that we have a raft of legislative progress around beneficial ownership in the last 10 years. EU directives, corporate transparency in the US and Canada. There are more than 100 countries now that have some form of commitment to beneficial ownership. The issue is often around how accessible and how public that data is, and we're going to get to that in our conversation. But there are broad alliances, and I see some familiar faces in the room who've worked hard over time in their own jurisdictions to help advance this agenda, as well as my colleagues here at the table with me. So in the last decade, we've met again and again on beneficial ownership. We've taken stock of progress, and we've also looked at the next bump in the road. And I looked back at some of those summits and meetings and so on to see what the heck did we talk about. And I found an interesting one a few years ago at the Open Government Partnership Summit in Ottawa, 2019. One of those sessions jumped out to me. We organized a session as B team on the competing interests of the public interest rationale around beneficial ownership information and privacy. And lo and behold, here we are a few years later, and that issue is again high on the agenda, and I know it will come up today. We've had a court case that's come out in the last week that has put that front and center again. But what goes around comes around, and I don't want to either undermine the progress or fail to emphasize the way this is really a broad-based coalition. There's been a lot of collective action around this issue. And one can look back at the many kinds of collaboration and voice and letter writing and support that we've had, and really, I think, feel a sense of achievement. Nevertheless, there's still a hill ahead of us. So today we're here to talk a little bit more in detail about what role have companies had and can companies have in driving beneficial ownership as we move forward. And to join me in that conversation, I'd like to welcome my panelists, our speakers. We will start with Tom Townsend. Tom is the Executive Director of Open Ownership. It's a civil society organization dedicated to promoting beneficial ownership transparency, a data standard around that, a register. Tom is the first ED of Open Ownership. He's been in that role about 3.5 years. He's been building a mighty organization, and I'm very proud, and I have to state my interest here that the B team was one of the founding partners and organizers around Open Ownership's mission. Tom is really ideally suited for this role. He ran open data policy inside the UK government before he took on this position, and he worked on such important moments for the anti-corruption world as the seminal London Anti-Corruption Summit in 2016. So welcome, Tom. And I'm going to introduce the two others before you kick off. To my right, we've got a duo of Robinsons. To my right, Mark Robinson. Mark is Executive Director of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. This is really the model child of collective action for anyone who follows public sector, private sector, civil society initiatives. EITI is a standout. Mark is now in charge of an organization that's active in 56 member countries with, I think, more than 70 supporting companies aligned to the EITI standard. Mark has a distinguished career in international development. He's worked in government, in philanthropy, and civil society, and was an active founder in Open Government Partnership. So welcome, Mark. And finally, to my immediate left, Tim Robinson. Tim is an integrity professional. He's a lawyer, and he ran investigations on the law firm side relating to fraud and corruption before joining BHP as counsel in 2011. He left BHP, he came back to BHP, and now BHP is the global multinational mining company headquartered in Australia. His current role since 2016 is Chief Compliance Officer. He set up and designed BHP's compliance program. He's worked globally on BHP's risk systems, and he's also served on the board of TI Australia. So welcome to the panel. Before I hand off to Tom, I just wanted to give a word about how we'll run this. Basically hear from our three panelists, ask them a few questions along the way, let them ask each other a question or two in case they feel inspired and interested in something someone says, and then open up to all of you. And I really would like to have a conversation. We're not a big group, so look to you to be active, to take on comments, ideas, and questions you may have about business's role in this important agenda, and wanted to encourage everybody to use social media, if you do, to promote the ideas and learnings and takeaways that you have from the session. So thank you for your patience with me, and over to Tom to give us an overview, set the scene on BOT. Tom.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, everyone. Obviously, all of you are heroes for being sat here before 9 in the morning, so we all really appreciate it. As Robin said, I lead an organisation called Open Ownership. We are an organisation that works directly with about 30 governments around the world on the technical implementation of this reform. So getting legislation right, working with company registry authorities typically and treasuries to design the systems of disclosure. That's a technical task. It's usually digital, but making sure there's an understanding of what we are asking businesses to do when we're giving them a relatively complicated form to disclose all of the different people that are involved with their company ownership structure. And then the final part of all of that is we aggregate all available open data and put it in one place, make it searchable at register.openownership.org. And we create a standard, a data standard that helps governments structure this to make this information as usable as possible. So to set the scene on this, if we were to wind the clock back to maybe 2014, we would probably be sat in a room where some people would have a partial awareness of what this concept was, probably would have heard of it once or twice. And globally, you would encounter governments where, for the most part, they would look very blankly at you when you raised the issue of beneficial ownership, confused by the whole thing. Really, in 2016, at the London Anti-Corruption Summit, I think that's probably where the issue gets put on the map. Countries start committing to this in earnest. And fast forward to today, we have about 130 countries around the world committing to some form of beneficial ownership reform. For the most part, they're committing to publicly accessible information. That's an extremely fast rate of reform and change for a policy area. It typically doesn't happen like that. So I think collectively, we have all done, along with government partners and the companies that have been championing this, it's been an extraordinary effort to get us to a point today where we have so many countries prepared to take that leap. I can't think of a comparable policy reform. So that's where we are today. What we have seen as an organization in the last 7-8 months or so is an enormous rise in countries who are moving from commitment to actual action. And what we mean by that is that they are putting draft legislation in place and putting it before their elected chambers for passage to get this work done. So between sort of 2016 and sort of 2022-ish, beginning of the pandemic, I would say, lots of commitment, lots of good words, lots of kind words about the reform, lots of positivity about it. But it's really only been in the last year, I think, that we've seen this incredible uptick in people actually doing the hard work of legislating for this. That isn't where the journey stops, quite clearly. You then have to put a system in place to get companies to disclose. And then I think actually this is where we're at right now and why this panel is timely, because it's that leadership that's going to drive compliance. It's that leadership from companies, from governments, and from civil society that's going to keep banging the drum, explaining what beneficial ownership is, talking about why it matters, and helping people understand both how to comply and why to comply. So I think that's kind of the leadership challenge we have now. I think we don't necessarily need another push around commitment. That's high, that's good. Now it's about actually driving the implementation of this. And there's some pretty worrying stats on what that actually looks like globally. And I use this a lot because it's extraordinary in lots of ways. The Financial Action Task Force, which is the global international standard-setting body on everything to do with anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing, has recommendations. And the recommendation for beneficial ownership is recommendation 24. That was updated in March of this year. It's much more ambitious, requiring information to be verified, among other things. The old recommendation 24, FATF, by its own analysis, says that only 9% of countries were effective at meeting that recommendation. 9% of countries. 16% of OECD countries were effective, only 7% of non-OECD countries were effective. That rounds out to 9% globally. So 9% of countries were effective on meeting the old, less ambitious, easier to implement FATF recommendation 24. We now have a new one that's far harder to do. In a resource-constrained environment, many governments struggling with inflation, their budgets going down, all of the things that we know about. So the point on leadership now is about compliance and explaining what this means for businesses, but it's also about continuing to drive the point home that none of this will work unless we get good implementation. And that has not been happening. And that's really why my organization exists, to try and help fill that gap. Before I hand back to Robin, I have an ask of all of you. So on this table, I have 7 copies of this document. So for 7 lucky winners, what this document says, or outlines rather, really solid use cases about how this data is used to detect and prevent corruption. So the one thing I ask of you, for the 7 lucky winners, this is also available online, please look at this. Read just one of the case studies. So when somebody asks you the question, why does this matter? What is this for? Why should we bother? Just have one good case study at hand to tell them about. And there's a ton in here. That's the most helpful thing you can do, I think, to help drive the message home that this is workable, deliverable, and useful. Yes. I don't know.
Is that working? Yes.
Yeah, that good.
I wanted to ask you, can you tell us one of those stories?
Yeah, it gets quite detailed. I think one of my favorite stories here is really the use of data from the Luxembourg register to show that the former president of Argentina was driving a bunch of contracts for onshore wind farms to his brother. The family netted about $70 million. We found that out because Luxembourg did have public data and could show the corporate structures relating to his brother all the way back through the family to him. So I would say Argentinian wind farms is the best case study, but it will take a little while to go into detail on that. But yeah, check it out, read it, have it in the back of your brain, ready.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to hand off to Mark now, and I'm going to ask a little bit about EITI's experience with beneficial ownership transparency. How does this feature when you're working on governance in the oil, gas, and mining sector? What do the companies have to say? How are you engaged?
I was thinking about what Tom was saying in relation to the perplexity of what beneficial ownership transparency felt like in 2014. I remember being heading governance in DFID at the time, and many of us scratching our heads and thinking, what exactly is this beast? And I think we need to be, when we think back and to what we were trying to grapple with now, there's still a lot of people around the world trying to figure out what is this thing. And I think we need to be somewhat modest as we move this agenda so that it doesn't just become something that us in small hotel rooms like this think is really important. It is really complex and politically challenging for people to take this agenda on. We at the EITI have had this as a requirement in our standard now since 2016, so quite early on, and toughened that up in 2020. So it is something that all countries, 57 countries in the EITI, now have to move towards the creation of a public accessible register of owners in oil, gas, and mining. So we do believe this is an agenda that really matters. It's something that we work on together with open ownership in a joint program to really deepen understanding, commitment, and the legislative frameworks around beneficial ownership transparency in 10 countries of the world to serve as exemplars to others to follow. So in the EITI, implementing countries and companies must disclose beneficial ownership information. And this includes companies that apply for or hold a participating interest in exploration or production in oil, gas, and mining, and must include the identities of beneficial owners, the level of ownership, and details about how that ownership is controlled or exerted. So all relevant companies in the extractive sector in all 57 countries must disclose above a certain material threshold. That means a lot of reporting has to be done, and we're still at the early stage of that reporting. It is, for the most part, the large international companies like BHP that you'll hear about who've been leading the charge. But much more has to be done, particularly for the small and medium enterprise sector, especially in mining. So back in 2021, 1st of September, we convened a meeting at which 6 of our companies, including BHP, put out a very strong set of public commitments about being champions for this agenda. And this is something I underline as the importance of companies championing. It makes a huge difference given the power and influence they exert in countries where they have a significant presence. So when I meet chambers of commerce or business associations in which our companies are represented, I keep emphasizing the importance of championing it, not simply waiting for the government to be the first mover. So building on that initial set of commitments from Anglo American, BHP, Glencore, Newmont, Repsol, and Rio Tinto, we've moved further. We now have a set of company expectations for the EITI that sets out 9 high-level commitments on accountability and transparency in line with the EITI standard for them to follow. The companies are going to go through an assessment process managed by the Secretariat, and those results, in terms of how far they're progressing, will be published late spring next year, including progress on beneficial ownership transparency. The importance here is it does show where there is corporate leadership. It also shows where some companies still need to step up further as EITI supporting companies, and again, where they can further champion this set of reforms. So the commitments we have is companies will identify and use beneficial ownership data in due diligence processes, including taking risk-based steps to identify the beneficial owners of joint venture partners, contractors, and suppliers. And that itself, you can see, is a further significant commitment, and is a further way that those companies can exercise greater influence and championing. So we'll see how we get on when we publish that set of results next spring. The other thing I would say is that we hope that the Opening Extractives program that Open Ownership and ourselves are engaged in will also further catalyze greater company engagement and championing of this agenda in the 10 countries in which we're operating. The latest initiative, and this is something that Robin and B-Team and BHP have been particularly involved with, and she mentioned the importance of bringing in the professional services companies. And here I'm talking about the big 6, BDO, Grant Thornton, EY, KPMG, Deloitte, and PwC. Good slip there. That'd be an interesting coalition. Yes. The reason that we need them to engage with and commit to this agenda, of course, is that they play a fundamental role around both auditing, but also in terms of the importance of ownership information in the work that they do. They can exercise significant influence. We had hoped there would be a 5th member of this panel representing one of those companies, and still very much hope to see more public commitment from that set of important actors. And it's actually thanks to BHP and some of our other member companies of the EITI that those conversations are happening. So we need to broad base the company dialogue around beneficial ownership transparency well beyond the current set of actors, and of course well beyond the extractive sector too. But we can play an important role in that sector alone. So let me pause there for now, Robin, and hand over.
Thank you, Mark. That's a great introduction to the work of EITI. And before I come back to you with a question, because business isn't the obvious actor here, I wanted us to take a little bit of a step back. in a lot of the things that happen in the governance and transparency space, we think of civil society identifying a problem and working with government and very committed, public sector officials working hard to get things passed. But we don't always have business at the table confronting the issue and shaping the issue alongside. And this is a real opportunity where that has happened. And there have been an interesting kind of collection of allies over time, unexpected allies, if one thinks about some of the sectors that the anti-corruption community has and hasn't worked with. We've been very involved in extractives, very involved in pharmaceuticals, very involved in healthcare more broadly, construction. But one area where it's been tricky, I have to say, is finance. And yet business from finance world, so banking, is a very strong partner on this agenda because of the Know Your Customer requirements around onboarding customers and clients. So we've been able, through this work, to reach out to new allies. However, there's a lot of businesses that would say that, revealing too much or wanting to know too much in our supply chain about who we work with and who owns companies, that's commercial confidentiality. That's data privacy. These are sort of the old arguments, the standards for business feeling uncomfortable and not wanting to step up and be at the table. And there was an interesting ruling last week, Tom, at the European Court of Justice around this issue. And since I think this comes up, and I want to have the audience be aware of it and also talk about it a bit in our discussion, do you think you could précis for us a little bit what happened and what challenge it might bring and why it means we need to double down on business support on this agenda? Thanks.
Oh, it's one of my favorite topics. Good. 22nd of November, European Court of Justice ruled that general public access to beneficial ownership information within the EU was invalid. And the part that was invalid was the provision in the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive that gave for public access, general public access. The background on this, there are a few cases that were brought in Luxembourg. The one that the court sort of focused on most was the case of somebody that requested an exemption from their data being public, beneficial ownership data being public, because they felt that they were at risk of harm. This was someone who had multiple business interests outside of the EU, primarily in East Africa. So they asked for that exemption. And an exemption on the grounds of potential harm is effectively standard in all regimes around the world. The exemption was not granted, so they brought a case in the Luxembourg courts. The Luxembourg courts felt, I think rightly, that this was a matter for European law, and therefore it ended up in the European Court. What the judgment says, very simply, is that strictly speaking, I kind of paraphrase, but these are some of the core phrases. Strictly speaking, general public access to beneficial ownership data is not necessary for the purposes of fighting money laundering and countering terrorist financing. That's the ruling. It's essentially a proportionality test, which exists within the General Data Protection Regulation and most other data protection regimes. Is it proportionate for the general public to have access? Is it proportionate for that invasion of privacy to meet that very narrow public policy goal? And the courts find, or the court rather finds, that it isn't. What that means in practice, and helpfully the court issued a clarifying note on this yesterday, which they only published on LinkedIn. It may well be on their website by now, but we felt that was a bit of an odd move. So it's obviously a well-drafted judgment because they had to publish a clarification. Clarification says that the press and civil society, and those defining terms I think are really important, the press and civil society have a legitimate interest case to access information for the purposes of fighting money laundering, countering terrorist financing. So effectively what the court judgment does, and the court makes this clear in its clarifying note, we return to the state of play under the 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, where you could get access if you had a legitimate interest case to see the data. In practice, you never got access. No one would reply, it would take weeks. Interestingly, the commission during the hearing was asked by the court, why did you not go down a legitimate interest route on this? Why did you go general access? Because you should always revert to the least invasive approach, which would be legitimate interest. The commission says, well, we thought about that, and it's unworkable. couldn't define who the press were, couldn't define who civil society were. Definitions of those don't really exist in the EU for the most part. So it was unworkable. So we went with general interest because that didn't work. So what the court has now effectively done is thrown it back to the Commission to now put in place a workable system that they themselves said was not workable. So that's the state of play. I'm not all doom and gloom about it. I mean, I think, we will find a way through. It's right as societies, we continually revisit the issue around data minimization. Do we need to publish all this personally identifiable information? You should revisit that as technology moves on, as more data for comparison and larger scale analysis comes on board. But what the Commission has yet to do, and we're only 2 weeks into this in fairness, is really say very much about what it plans to do. So our ask of them is that the Commission puts energy, time, and effort now into sitting down with everyone that's concerned to figure out how we do create a system that works for everybody. I don't know if they're going to do that, but that would be our ask. Final point on all of this, as I think we all know, what happens in the EU doesn't stay in the EU. It makes the weather globally. Countries around the world are looking to this judgment, and those people that hated public access, this is manna from heaven, this is gold. For those that want public access, it's a disaster. But around the world, we have company registrars who are inundated, and I really do mean that, by businesses and corporate service providers in their country saying, why on earth are you still publishing this data? The European Court of Justice says this is a violation of our human rights. The European Court of Justice has no jurisdiction there, but nevertheless. So we need to get clarity on this, and we need the Commission to take it sort of play the leadership role that it has, whether it likes it or not, and say something clear to the rest of the world about what this means and how they're going to take it forward. Very, 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 very final point. Not all member states have reacted to this judgment in the same way. Latvia, Estonia, and France have not shut their registers down. So I think that tells you something about the stability of this judgment. So there's a lot to play for. And I come back to my ask. Know the case studies. Tell people why this matters. Tell people why it works. Use the evidence for it. That is our best bet in protecting what we have fought for a very long time to get.
And meanwhile, we have a lot of practice and use of these registers, even as we're humbly aware that data needs improving, and we need to expand them and make sure they can be used and accessible in other places. It's a bit sort of a slap in the face to business practice and other access for others who are interested and have been working with this information. But Mark, what does this case mean for EITI?
We are watching it like hawks for the reason that Tom said, because of the potential contagion effect, as I call it. It could really make reformers think again. If Europe is going to do it differently, why should we still progress towards public registers? That remains an EITI requirement. Only 3 EITI implementing countries are currently European Union members. Netherlands, Germany, Norway is, I think, affected by this legislation. Tom, you have to clarify that for me. The UK being the exception there. So we need to actually work closely with the UK, the US, and now Australia having committed to public registries. So we have a coalition of the willing, which is still able to make the case very strongly. But also we need to double down our efforts in those countries who may be more reticent until there is clarity on what this means to them. We're not going to change our commitment in the EITI standard unless my board gets cold feet by the time it meets again next year, which I doubt. And I think it comes back to companies themselves also continuing to play that championing effort. They can still continue to commit to reveal. It doesn't depend solely on a public register to do that. So I think, if anything, more expectation from us around the company expectations we have in the EITI. Like Tom, I don't see this as an existential threat to the agenda. I think there's a lot of work can still be done. We have many countries that are far from public registers still. They're still in the very, very early stages. So there's huge scope to still get the information presented in the right way, more comprehensive, to have different parts of governments working together. We and our colleagues in open ownership were in Indonesia the other week, where this responsibility sits across different parts of government. So sometimes it's quite a basic coordination task just to make sure the information is in one place and it's accessible. One worry I have is it could move us backwards towards pay for information. Even if it is for civil society and the media, a risk that the firewalls go up and it just becomes a very expensive endeavor to collect that information. So there are risks along the way.
Thanks, Mark. I hope we can mitigate the risks. And I think there's some parallels. Now, we've all said that this issue started off as not well known 15 years ago, but I think if I think about the commitments that companies and the private sector have made to addressing climate change, that even when certain unnamed administrations were thinking of removing entire countries from commitments to an ambitious climate agenda and commitments around net zero and 1.5, business stood up and said, not with us. Sometimes different levels of government stood up and said, from cities and regional capitals, you know, don't take away the progress we've had. And I think this is an example of how we can look to companies right now to say, there's a business reason to have beneficial ownership transparent, for us to know more about who we work with, who we have contracts with, and to know that the competition is fair for the work that we do and the business we do. So why is this such a yes topic for BHP? Tim.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, everyone. It's great to see even more people here than they were at the start, so that's great. So look, I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of context just about BHP, for those who are not familiar with the company, and our current views on the fight against corruption more broadly, and then where this beneficial ownership campaign, beneficial ownership transparency campaign fits in. So for those who don't know, we're a leading global resources company. We've got offices and operations in about 90 different locations around the world, and customers and supply chains globally. At the moment, one of our focuses is looking to help the world to decarbonise. So we're looking at a number of developing a number of resources to help address climate change and the energy transition. So copper for electrification, nickel for batteries in electric vehicles, potash for sustainable agriculture, and iron ore and steel making commodities for infrastructure that's needed to support renewable development. So we are very committed to operating sustainably and ethically. And as we're looking now at where we will be sourcing and developing future-facing commodities in years to come, we certainly see a significant amount of growth in commodities like copper and nickel because of the need for those to be developed to support climate change. But when you look at where a lot of the major remaining copper and nickel resources are located, they're in countries with higher perceived levels of corruption, and many countries that are really at a fork in the road in terms of their own fight against corruption. And so, well, if those resources and if the development of those resources is well governed, they have the potential to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. But if they're poorly governed, there's potential for the resource curse to happen all over again. Potential for a lot of a lot of harm to be caused, including political instability and security issues, and ultimately a lot of delay in the development of those resources. Potentially then putting at risk the climate transition as well. So, in that space, we see this as a really critical moment in the fight against corruption globally, it's really in that context that we come to the beneficial ownership transparency movement, and we have supported beneficial ownership transparency for a long time. We were a founding director, I think, on the board of EITI, and have supported these initiatives for some time. But really, transparency. Beneficial ownership transparency, together with the other transparency measures around contracts and payments, is really a foundational principle in the fight against corruption. Obviously, other elements are critical, recognising the rights of landowners in our industry, making sure there's meaningful community participation in decisions that affect them, and meaningful accountability, but really genuine transparency of information about all across the resources value chain really empowers all elements of the fight against corruption in our industry. So raising the resource governance bar in that way is a real priority for us. And I think the private sector also is uniquely placed, as all of my colleagues have been saying, to actually make a difference in this space and use our voice and leverage to drive change. So we also have in addition to the social value that can be promoted by more ethical development of resources, we also have a business reason to pursue the fight against corruption as well, which is really around creating a level playing field and ensuring that corrupt companies don't get an unfair advantage when they're competing with ethical companies for the right to develop these resources, and so that there's fair competition to develop resources based on the amount of value that the company can provide for the host government and host communities. On beneficial ownership specifically, we also do see three key benefits for companies, really. So first and foremost is probably what I've been talking about, the opportunity to reduce corruption. A number of you will be familiar with the various corruption scandals where there's been concealed ownership by corrupt officials in entities which have won government contracts or which hold mining tenements, and preventing that through public beneficial ownership registers is really valuable, and does help to level the playing field. Second, the commitments and requirements for ultimate beneficial ownership, whether they come from the EITI or other industry standards, or through the commitments that Mark referred to that a number of the major companies made, those commitments really send an important advanced signal through the whole supply chain. And we're hoping that by publicly committing to those things, it actually acts as a disincentive to this form of corruption, in the sense that suppliers who want to do business with any of the majors are now very aware that the major companies in our industry have committed to looking at beneficial ownership. Likewise, smaller mining companies that might look to be one day bought by one of the majors are aware that all of the majors will be looking at beneficial ownership transparency when they do that. And so the commitment can cascade down through the supply chain and through the industry in that way. And third, beneficial ownership data and public data makes it easier and less expensive and more reliable for us to do due diligence on all of the third parties that we deal with. That's a critical component of any anti-corruption compliance program, and it's an expectation of the enforcement agencies. For us, we've got over 9,000 suppliers, and we obviously have the resources to run a big due diligence program to make sure we know who we're dealing with. But for smaller companies who don't have the same level of resources, public beneficial ownership registers will be a real benefit in that respect as well.
Thank you so much, Tim, also for outlining those three interwoven, rationales for business to be on board and for BOT to be such a key issue for you at BHP. What do you think is the biggest challenge to BOT as an effective anti-corruption measure for a company? Yeah, so
that's an interesting question, and I think leaving aside the European judgment, which I think we've talked about already, but I think as with any transparency initiatives, transparency itself is not enough to solve the problem of corruption. So simply getting the data out there in a public register is not going to be enough. I think it's critical for there to be an accountability mechanism to hold corrupt actors accountable for what's revealed in the data that is published. And that's not only important for catching people who are already corrupt. I think, to my mind, that one of the most powerful effects of the transparency agenda and beneficial ownership transparency agenda is its preventative effect. So that if corrupt actors or potentially corrupt actors are aware that there is a requirement to disclose, or that their counterparties, such as us, will be disclosing under EITI, and they're aware that there is an accountability mechanism, then that is a very strong disincentive to engaging in that form of corruption in the first place. And that's an extremely valuable thing. So I think really accountability mechanisms would be a focus. But on that, it's important to recognise, I think, that in some countries we'll have differing levels of accountability mechanism. You may not have a free press everywhere, or the usual democratic mechanisms such as elections. And in those places, from a private sector perspective, there's other opportunities for accountability, I think, and that's where we do look to industry standards and potentially ESG standards as potentially effective mechanisms to drive accountability for companies that are engaging in corrupt conduct. And so this is a sort of emerging area, but we're interested to explore how ESG standards could be made clearer in their anti-corruption components, to maybe specify some beneficial ownership commitments. And I think that would obviously have an impact on effectively the cost of capital for players in our industry. And of particular interest in the context of the climate transition is we're seeing a lot of interest in customers for particularly our battery raw materials in the sustainability of the minerals that we're providing them. And so some of our customers are looking to some of the industry standards to gauge and measure the sustainability of the products coming into their supply chain, because it's part of their pitch to retail customers. And so we are now, and last year we announced an agreement with Tesla, for example, which was in part based around our ability to produce sustainable nickel. And so I think there's potentially there, if there's another area to look at in terms of an accountability mechanism, would be to feed beneficial ownership transparency commitments into some of those standards that customers look at. And then I think you've effectively potentially unleashed a real economic incentive for members of our industry to live up to these commitments. If customers are asking for it, any business is going to be interested in it. So I think that's potentially another interesting area to look at for accountability.
There is I think there's another session here in these days on ESG, and I think it's really important that we get these sort of health labels on companies right going forward, whether it's customers or suppliers or investors, indeed, that we're looking at the same things across companies and trying to get best possible measures. The ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which was set up by IFRS, to look at, particularly from an investor point of view, but with broader implications, what companies need to report on, and to try to work that through the system globally. We'll be consulting in the first half of next year on just what should be reported. And they've done a consultation already on the E bits, the climate mostly. But I think going forward, there's a lot to play for from our community being active to make sure that G and issues such as beneficial ownership appear relevant in that very important reporting standard, which looks like where the future is going in terms of globalized standards. I want to give the panel a moment to comment and reflect on what they've heard from each other. So I hope you're all getting itchy in your seats and are ready to ask really tough questions or make a comment or contribute your experience. I may call on some of you if you're looking too quiet, because I see a couple of familiar faces on the floor. I guess just because he whispered something in my ear, I'm going to hand the mic back to Mark and ask him to step in first.
Yes, I was whispering about politics. This is not a dry technical agenda. And you may be wondering, why would companies oppose this? It only sounds like a good thing. I have been in repeated meetings during my travels of facing enormous pushback, especially from family-owned mining companies in different countries, especially those companies who have significant interest from politically exposed persons, i.e. politicians with a big stake. And they want to keep things as they are because they do not want light shed on their ownership, either because they may not be revealing it in asset registers as they should be, either as civil servants or as elected parliamentarians. They want to make sure that the contracting process is kept tight and it maintains their interests in securing access to those. They want to make sure the license regime continues to favor their companies. I was in Guyana earlier this year, and I had probably the strongest single pushback on this agenda I have yet encountered from a nameless leader of the mining association saying, "How dare you push this agenda on us? This is something we're not going to do. Are you telling me that I'm going to go back to tell my wife and children this information is going to be published, and I'll then be vulnerable to kidnapping or worse? Please, Mr. Robinson, take that agenda elsewhere." This is at the sharp end of where we have a lot of work to do. And again, it's great to have international companies like BHP with these very strong upfront commitments, but in practice, there's a huge base of potential resistance, which we need to engage with and work through business associations and chambers of commerce in countries to say, no, this is a good agenda, it matters for you, and improves the business environment, and as Tim said, creates a level playing field. There are many out there who don't want that playing field to be leveled out through beneficial ownership transparency.
Yeah, just sort of reflect on that. I mean, if only the kind of only sign of outward visible wealth was being listed in a beneficial ownership register that put you at harm of being kidnapped. I once met somebody who said, in our culture, we don't really like to display our wealth. And he was wearing a Rolex. So there are legitimate points, I think, about harms that come from this. And I think we have got to a place globally where exemption regimes are well legislated for and the operation of them is quite well designed. But yeah, those sorts of stories of pushback are very real. They don't seem to be terribly rooted in at least the reality that they're putting forward. And one final point, I think, Robin, you said earlier, business isn't an obvious partner here. Well, it kind of is in so many ways. I know what you mean, but it is because fundamentally we ask companies as part of any basic due diligence process to know who they're working with. Yet as a global economy, we have decided until recent years to make that as hard as possible when it comes to basic information and make that costly. A basic due, and Tim, you will have a better answer to this. I mean, a basic due diligence process can cost thousands of dollars, a slightly more detailed one, tens of thousands of dollars. So we've decided to make basic due diligence the preserve of companies with the resources to do it. And that blows my mind. So business is the obvious partner here because we cannot expect them to be better if we decide to make the barrier to entry to being better so high.
Oh, no, I agree completely. And I think one of the other things that I'd add to that point around the cost of due diligence is that historically it's tended to be more expensive where it's most important, in the sense that the countries that have the highest levels of corruption typically are not able to fund the electronic registries and good access to data. And so you actually need people on the ground to go and ask at the registry, which is a whole nother level of cost. And so not only is it disincentivizing the small and medium players who really need to do it, but it's disincentivizing it most in where it needs to be really done.
Well, I'd like to thank the speakers for this great sort of tour de table of the issue, the challenges, the recent challenge, as well as why this matters so much, including for business, and just open up to all of you. What are your experiences? What brought you here this morning? What is the private sector saying in your country? Is government nervous about this? Are they on board? What are the challenges you see? James. Do you need a mic? Maybe.
It was wonderful to have any
Everybody, thanks for the presentation. Well, to give an update on Canada, I mean, despite everything happening in Europe, we still have a pledge from our federal government for a publicly accessible registry, and we hope that the government won't backtrack. Part of our success in getting this forward was establishing a coalition and partnership with business associations in Canada. So we had the Money Service Business Association of Canada signed on up for public registry. We had the Canadian Real Estate Association, very importantly, call for a registry, mostly because they now have to do beneficial ownership due diligence. Their original position was to not want to have to do any beneficial ownership due diligence. The Federation of Law Societies of Canada agreed to it. The one business association that we desperately wanted to approve this and we could never get was the Canadian Banking Association. I'd be very interested to hear from others about their banking associations. And we had fans in the financial institutions sector, but the banks wouldn't fully endorse it, nor would the CBA. And recently I was at a panel where the chief AML officers of the major banks were all kind of skeptical towards a public beneficial ownership registry, saying, you know, the verification system wouldn't work, then we're liable for the data, and they were essentially all comes down to liability, because right now the banks are the front line of AML, and they have to do the review of clients coming in. And with the registry, we want the government to finally say publicly, we are liable for verification of data. And even though somebody was there from Finance Canada who said as much, it took them 5 times to say that, to answer that question directly, the banks are still skittish that they see that the data won't be reliable, that they're still being called on to help clean some of the data, and therefore they might be legally liable for some of the data, or if they onboard somebody based on bad data, what does that mean for them? So it was a key sector of the economy that we were trying to get on board, and to hear all these AML officers all be skeptical and one say, careful what you wish for, was really kind of a blow to hear them finally say it. So I'd really love to hear other people what banking associations say. On the mining front in Canada, I mean, of course, globally, they would love to see beneficial ownership registries in other countries. Haven't heard too much endorsement for BO registries in Canada because, you know, corruption doesn't happen in mining in Canada.
There's a question at the back. Please say who you are. Yeah.
Hi, Liz Hart, currently running the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption project at the World Wildlife Fund. And Mark, thanks for talking about politics. And I think I want to talk about allies for a minute. The purpose of the project that we have at the World Wildlife Fund is to bring anti-corruption considerations a little bit more into the conservation and natural resource community and the environmental community. I don't know this, and maybe I should, but how is, I should say this first, we've raised the issue of beneficial ownership transparency and gotten a lot of interest from the people working on illegal and unregistered and unregulated fishing, a lot of interest from the people that are working on illegal logging, illegal wildlife trade. How is the beneficial ownership transparency community reaching out to the environmental community? I haven't seen it yet, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. But I think there's a real opportunity to do some more education, because I think there's still within the environmental community kind of a, is this really our thing? But we have the Forest Sustainability Certification Council. We have a lot of other mechanisms. So is there room here for some allyship that we need to develop a little bit further?
Thanks, Liz. Let's take another question or two and then come back to the panel. So here in front and then in back. Thanks.
Hi, Richard Grissel, Center for International Private Enterprise. So picking up on your last point, Robin, you're talking about the IFRS, or trying to set standards for ESG. And with the EU's decision to fight against the public registers, what room are you seeing for a potential voluntary standard on BOT, similar to like fair tax mark or a certified B Corp? Is that a feasible idea in your opinions?
Okay, one last one, and then we've also got some questions from online. Please, in the back, yeah.
Hi there, Jeff Geipel of Engineers Without Borders. First, I want to really congratulate and applaud BHP for increasing transparency in its suppliers. We work on a project right now in let's just say a West African country, and we're trying to increase local procurement, and we keep running into barriers where the suppliers that we want to displace who are importing products are owned by government officials. The problem is that everyone knows this, but nothing actually happens. And so I guess a practical question is, once we know that, for example, in this case, that the president's brother owns the biggest importer of chicken, and therefore growing chickens locally is quite difficult, how do we actually then make it into a political movement to change that? Because in this case, everyone knows who owns the chicken importer, but nothing actually is changing. So just a question on the next steps.
Okay, over to the panel. There was some interesting questions there. Does anyone want to jump in with comments?
I'm going first, am I? Okay, well, from a natural resources perspective, I guess probably just the question around the conservation question. It does seem like an obvious area, and especially I think to some of the conservation initiatives around REDD+ and ones that depend on land access, and very similar issues really conceptually to the resources industry. And so I would see a lot of synergies, and I don't know if the reach out's happening, but it's a great idea. So that's probably the best one for me. I'm not sure I can really assist much on the other questions.
To the point around Canadian context, James, on AML officers saying careful what you wish for. Yeah, I mean fundamentally this is all about liability shielding and where it sits. And I think one of the big hold-ups in the rulemaking process here in the US was around exactly what responsibilities banks will have with respect to discrepancy reporting in the private central register here under FinCEN. Banks, I think, quite legitimately were saying, you're going to ask us to tell you when your data's wrong, but you're not going to allow us to rely on it for our own purposes. That sounds like a lot of extra costs for not much gain. I have some sympathy for that. So I think you have to we have to work through what it means to have liability around the use of data. But I think, going back to the ML point, I don't know what the situation is in Canada. We don't see that many banks actually being penalized in the current regime for doing it poorly. So, if they're relying on this data, I'm sorry, are they suggesting that somehow their systems are much better than what government could produce and verify? Because I doubt that's true, because we're all working with the same information at the end of the day. So, yeah, I think the liability point and the chain of liability point is one of the big issues in this, which is massively underexplored. I think to the point around kind of allyship with the wider conservation community, yeah, absolutely. I think it's been more of a question of sort of time and headspace than anything else. The more people that know about this, the more time, the more organizations that work on it, the better we can do of that. It's not for want of thinking it's a good idea. I think, yeah, it's been time and headspace. Just to that final point about what you do with the data, I mean, that's, I guess, a much longer conversation about how you use transparency to build a political movement for change. And we don't have time for that now, I don't think. But we do a lot of work largely with groups of investigative journalists in smaller jurisdictions to explain what this means, explain what they're looking at, and do the long-term hard work of helping people craft stories that will gain domestic and international attention about exactly those stories. And I think that's a contribution to it, but I think it's only part of the story about how you move from knowledge and insight about company ownership, which, as you say, everyone kind of knew anyway, to a point at which you achieve change. That's the $1 trillion question.
Yeah, good and hard questions. Maybe on the last point also, I mean, another issue that comes up is strategic litigation, if it's appropriate, if some part of the law is being violated, is using, of course, the courts and the justice system to enforce rules around conflict of interest or competition. But as Tom said, it's a broader issue than how one gets society engaged when wrongdoing is so apparent. And we want to go through legal means, obviously, to make that happen. But nevertheless, on the voluntary disclosure question, I think we see an EITI voluntary disclosure around the standard, and I think there's probably other areas such as work that I know we've done at the B team around responsible tax and other places and spaces where companies see the value of being in front. They see where the wind is blowing, and that by stepping up and having a strong regime on something, they can be ahead of the curve. And get credit for it in the sense that they build the field and they help shape the field. Because when you are walking the talk, you have the right to be at the table and hopefully shape some of the rules that are coming. So I do think we can look at voluntary. It's usually not sustainable long term if one wants to really see change effective. But I think it can set the tone from the biggest companies and certainly influence throughout the supply chain. So there's some, at least, limited evidence that it can work for a while and that it's an important first step sometimes to get things moving. We've got a couple of questions online that I'd like to turn to as you continue to think of yours. The first one is from Michael Barron. What can be done to promote the benefits to business of accessing and using beneficial information? Another question, perhaps to Mark. Are there good examples where EITI's beneficial ownership regime has expanded to be broader than just the extractive sector? And let's see, at least one more. What risk or benefits do you see with, it says here, allowing corporate leadership in BOT? Will BOT apply to the smallest of companies? So some questions for the panel.
Well, as I've been saying, BOT needs to increasingly apply to the medium and small enterprise sector. That's where most of the opposition lies. That's where most of the hard work is going to be needed. Liz, your question on other sectors, undoubtedly forests and fishing, as you implied, but also land. I'm reminded about the debates in India decades ago around Benami land holdings. In countries like India with very strict limitations on land holdings by state, it's been a very long practice of putting land titles under names of relatives, dead people even, all kinds of people other than the real owners. So in land, I would have thought there's huge potential as well. It links to some of the interesting innovations on real estate. For us, the question about the effect of using registries in the extractive sector to promote economy-wide reforms, I think Nigeria is the best example of that. And it has to be those countries where the extractive sector is a very significant material part of the economy, so it can exercise that sort of wider influence. If it isn't, then it's not going to make a huge amount of difference economy-wide. And maybe Tom can speak to some of the sort of the practice in Nigeria about how it has, in essence, been a really important driver of a much wider set of commitments and an integrated register. So we do realize that building registers of owners in the extractive sector needs to be part of a wider effort so that it's not just sitting on its own. So it's an entry point in economies where the problem of corruption risk is very significant, ownership is opaque, and where it's a very significant material part of the economy.
On extractives as an entry point, actually, Armenia is an interesting example of sort of where the extractive sector doesn't make up a huge amount of the economy, but it was the entry point because during a revolution there not very many years ago, ownership within the mining sector was a big issue as part of that, and how that was being used and abused. So I think it's like where it's a big part of the economy and where it's been a big political issue, we see that as an entry point. And then in both of those cases, Nigeria and Armenia, you see disclosure requirements expanding outwards to the wider economy. In the case of Nigeria, it's been a 4 or 5 year effort, really, to go from having an extractive specific register that was launched in, I think, December of 2019 to today, where we have a full economy register that was sort of officially launched 2 weeks ago. We're about to get all of the data in our data standard. It's going to be structured. It's going to be open. But a lot of the hard work there has been around that internal business process change of getting departments outside of the most obvious ones, Treasury typically, to engage with the process of designing this, such that they end up with something that they can use and access both from a business process perspective and from a technical perspective. And that's just long, hard work of going around and sort of working with other departments who don't know about this issue to explain how it can be of value to them. And then, you know, you see that light bulb moment go off with most people, and it's just interesting hearing, Liz, you were talking about all the other sectors who are beginning to become aware of this and think this has applicability to us and use for us. It has applicability everywhere, because ultimately you kind of want to know who owns and controls stuff wherever you are and for whatever purpose. So when we share what this means and that it is practically achievable, pretty much any sector will go, there's an evident use case for this, and most government departments will do the same, because sort of ipso facto you want to know who you're working with. Just on the promoting benefits point, question from Michael. I think part of this is about, and actually the EU ruling I think is unhelpful, particularly on this point. A lot of sort of promoting the benefits is probably less about sort of telling, but more about doing. So what you typically see in terms of adoption of new data sources is you want to see them integrated into common tools people are using. You don't want to go out and tell them about beneficial ownership. You want to see a accounting software integrate an API of beneficial ownership straight into it, so that when you are onboarding a new customer or you're contracting with someone, the information's just there. Most businesses, smaller ones, don't have the time to engage with our kind of wonky policy debates, and nor should they. We just need to get to a point where the information is there, it's easy to use, it's ingested into common tools and services, and that relies on general access, and it also relies on good structured data. So I think you promote the benefits by doing rather than telling.
Just in terms of promoting the benefits and building this out to small and medium enterprises, I think in all industry sectors, it's normally possible to go up a supply chain until you find a company that really will have a strategic concern and a strategic interest in reducing corruption in an environment. And that's us, as I described earlier, in our sector. But in most sectors, there'll be companies that will have a real strategic interest in this, and that's the point at which they're the companies with the leverage to drive it through their supply chain. So I think that's a potential theory of change for spreading this out a little more to small and medium enterprises.
Hello, colleagues. I'm Tirot from TI Mongolia, and as Robin Mark knows, also with the multi-stakeholder groups with both EITI and OGP. So I have two quick comments and one question to the panel, yeah? Because I think generally for Asia Pacific, we are much, I think, lagging behind with the maybe few champions, like, I don't know, Indonesia, especially in the extractives, but also on the corporate, like South Korea. But I think for Mongolia, interestingly, both entry points for the beneficial ownership kind of a disclosure have been both extractive sectors, but also the banking and finance, yeah? Just to, I mean, as a rejoinder. Because as a former microfinance banker and leading the Bankers Association, we pushed first, even before the extractives, actually beneficial ownership disclosure in all the Mongolian banks, you know. And now we even pushed further, working with the parliament to and amended the commercial banking laws to, in a way, force also mandatory, for example, IPOs, initial public offerings, you know, for the top 5 largest corporate banks in Mongolia. And actually last week, one had successfully done that. But there's, I think, generally, I think, very now, at least in the banking sector, a very good, let's say, how do you say, a standard, yeah, for the beneficial ownership disclosure. Second, with the extractives, yeah, Mark knows that we've been working as a part of the EITI implementing country since 2006. And one of the hardest challenges for us was to get this beneficial ownership disclosure in the mining companies. Although we've been like part of the EITI, I mean, for many years. But what we managed to do was not just to do the beneficial ownership, let's say at least on the legal terms, disclosure mandatorily for the all mining companies, but also generally in the corporate sector, yeah, using the existing public corporate registry with the Ministry of Justice. But the challenge remains is that at least in Mongolia, and I think in many Asian countries also, they take the beneficial ownership too legalistically, meaning like maybe limiting just to the shareholders or investors. And what we now trying as we speak, actually, now on into fourth day, there have been large youth demonstration as part of actual outcome of our whistleblowing on the state-owned mining companies. And what they've been demanding is actually the notion of this political beneficial ownership disclosure. Because especially it's not just with the corporate, but I think the challenges, I think especially with Asian countries, there are large state-owned enterprises, you know, both in the extractives, but also in other sectors. And behind them, the actual beneficial owners are actually the politicians. So my question was, how to you kind of this bring about, let's say, I think maybe it's to do also not with the just with the standards, but also with the general corporate culture and the let's say the willingness of the or political will of the, you know, the governments, you know. How do you bring about this or kind of in a way champion and reform this disclosure of the political, let's say, beneficiaries of not just in the extractors but also in the other corporate sector, and second, actually related to that, I think the also how do you bring this? I think the just the beneficial ownership, for example, registries will not work alone, you know, stand alone, because they will be in the silos. Because what, especially in from the extractive sector, most of the money is actually siphoned to the south to the north. So what I believe is that we need to somehow to have a kind of a global, in a way, registry of the beneficial ownership, you know, like along the line what the OGP and with the partners done with the global data barometer. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Torod, and I think we're back to the future on the global register, Tom, so we'll come to you on that. Are there other, okay, there's another 2 questions in front, and then maybe we'll try to wrap up.
My question is actually quite linked to,
You are.
I'm Mary from UNODC, based in Pacific, but I used to be based in Myanmar. So my question is actually quite related to the last comments as well. So in Myanmar, there was the EITI from 2014 to 2021 when the military takeover happened, and it was actually extended to, it was extractive, but also timber. And at the same time, believe it or not, there was also a push for beneficial ownership, and we were quite advanced. And then the coup d'etat happened. So, but one of the elements that I would like to discuss was also, so SOEs, yes, it's one thing. But in Myanmar, and I think in other countries, I remember, I think there was in Turkey as well, MOEs, military owner enterprise. What are the incentives to go and to present their information? And here the access and the privacy is really problematic. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Benson from Uganda. I work with a public procurement regulatory agency. This concept of beneficial ownership transparency is very new in my country, not even more than 1 year. And the entry point has been public procurement. However, when some of these reforms are coming, there isn't much sensitization or awareness even to the bidders. And therefore, acceptability becomes very low. Yes, there is a legal framework, and say before you submit a bid, you must declare or disclose who the beneficiaries are. But most of the companies you find are owned by politicians and civil servants, but on record, you will never see them. How this money that is paid to contractors then pass over to the actual beneficiaries is not on record. I need to get more information, more experience from other countries. You have talked about due diligence, but how do you then link actually the one who is implementing a contract to the actual beneficiary? But again, there are other areas which are very lucrative. Like in my country, Uganda, there are licenses. For example, those who are running national parks, but you find similar conditionalities don't exist. You find people get tax holidays. If you are going to invest in my country, you get free land. You even get a tax holiday. But who is the investor? An investor is someone from US, but you find the beneficiary actually is a politician in Uganda. So we need to get this holistically so that we don't focus on public procurement, but there are other areas like licensing, tax holidays, investors, where these reforms haven't reached. Thank you.
I think it's a rather important question about how to get this on the agenda in places where it isn't. I think we're sometimes having a discussion of riches where it's already on the books, but we're having debates around not necessarily more academic things, but this seems like a fundamental question of lining up the dots around fiduciary and transparency across the financial system, public financial system. I think there's some good entry points there from experiences in other places. Tom, I was wondering if you could talk about, for example, how does the BOT register line up with the normal companies register, for example, to think about what the expectations are there in terms of just having basic information about companies practicing. We had a question on military-owned business, state-owned business. How about some final thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I mean, the beneficial ownership part of the story in terms of transparency is only one part. We also have to preserve and ensure and grow access to basic legal information. Directors, see Rebecca from Open Corporates here, would say the same thing. You know, we can't see backsliding on that either. So those two parts of the puzzle have to come together. There's no point in having beneficial ownership information if you don't also know the basic information about a company. Just to the question from a Ugandan colleague, there's no, having, as we would all say repeatedly here, having access to information that's not accurate is not terribly helpful, and having access to information that is accurate doesn't in and of itself create change. I think what we're looking at here is trying to create a kind of a sort of stepwise process where we're beginning to link more data and put it in the public domain that will give investigators and indeed journalists and civil society more threads to pull at, and create more of a platform for people to be able to start investigations, not necessarily complete them. And I think you have to see it as part of an incremental process. I think there are some quite technical fixes you can do around liability for false filing. So particularly if it's able to demonstrate that a company has been falsely filing beneficial ownership information, then leading to relatively quick strike-off or suspension processes, you can disincentivize the abuse of it. But again, that doesn't fix all of the problem overnight. You have to keep going with it. I think the kind of final point on the sort of sanctions and enforcement side of this for false filing, we get quite a lot of questions about sort of what are quick wins that we can have that push higher compliance, that stop short of us having new powers to arrest or imprison people or whatever else, because a lot of agencies don't and will never have that. I think a lot of this is about trying to bring together information from across the kind of government estate of data and present information about how a company is complying with other obligations that they have. So we have a beneficial ownership register and you're listing a company, you're saying, have they complied with this information? Did they do it on time? Have they kept their tax record up to date? Have they maintained whatever other compliance obligations they have across government? You are trying to, in data, I think, create a sense of how that business behaves, and that is a useful starting point for both prompting investigations and investigating wider corporate networks as well.
Tom, what is your takeaway from either what the panelists have said or from the audience today?
I think this point about allyship and awareness raising keeps coming back to me. We talk about it a lot. We do need to see a greater coalition of people. That's, part of the reason why I would come somewhere to this is to find that greater set of allies in other fields that can continue to tell people what this means, what you can do with this information, and just keep talking about the practicalities and the basics. So I'm going to say it one more time. Learn the case studies about this. Tell people about them. That brings it to life.
Tim, how about for you? What's coming back to Australia with you?
Well, I think that was a great wrap up, Tom. Actually, a lot of those things are one of the reflections. I think we've had a few questions about, how do we get reluctant stakeholders over the line? What's the case for this? I think and Mark, you may have a view on this, but my sense is from why this has gained momentum. One of the reasons why this has gained momentum in the extractive sector is that we know that we need trust. We need the trust of communities, and we need to provide the transparency to win the trust. So if there's an institution that wants the trust of the population or has an interest in winning that trust, this is an obvious step to take, and that's an obvious reason to do it. There were many other reasons, many of which I articulated, but I think that's one, that winning trust through transparency, earning trust through transparency is definitely a case for motivating this type of this agenda.
Thanks for that reflection. I think you're going to take the hard one on difficult regimes.
I couldn't put it better around trust, a really important fundamental basis why this information matters. There's massive skepticism, and rightly so, amongst many citizens about ownership structures. This can only help to dispel some of that. And much of that came through to us during our recent visit to a number of Asian EITI implementing countries toured. You made a really important point. We have underplayed the importance of this agenda for state-owned enterprises. And a similar point from Myanmar. In fact, interestingly, in Myanmar, we were beginning to take the wrappers off some of the military-owned companies before the tragic coup took place. And, well, there may be an association there, but it does show, with applied civil society pressure, that sort of commitment can be used to shed light on such companies. It didn't come up in conversation with Indonesia, where you similarly have military-owned companies. But the state-owned enterprises is certainly an entry point. The EITI has a growing number of state-owned enterprises are supporting companies, and the very newest one is a major state-owned enterprise in Indonesia. And I spent time with Pertamina in Jakarta, going through every single company expectation, saying, you've signed up for this. Does any of this provide a challenge? And they were very open and clear and committed around the importance of beneficial ownership transparency. Because as you say, Turod, it's often in these companies where patronage and opaqueness in ownership benefits self-interested politicians. We need to do more there. We've talked a lot today about small and medium enterprises, the leadership role of globally listed, publicly listed companies. The tough ones are the state-owned enterprises and possibly almost a next frontier point. So really important. Thank you for bringing that one forward. We had a question about military-owned enterprises. Now, actually, the case of Zimbabwe came to mind. We tried extremely hard a few years ago to bring Zimbabwe into EITI's fold. EITI would be enormously valuable to the people of Zimbabwe who don't see the just fruits of their considerable resources coming to them, in which military have a very significant interest in the extractive sector, and that opaqueness is just what they want for now. Opening up ownership structures in mining in Zimbabwe would be absolutely fundamental. That is why there's not that much political appetite right now for Zimbabwe to join the EITI. So it's back to the politics and why this matters so much.
We've hit the hour, and I want to thank everybody for sharing the first session of today with us. It was a fabulous discussion. It's hard to wrap up all the perspectives that were shared, but I think one thing I take away is it certainly does take a village. We have strong private sector arguments, and we have strong private sector support. So for those of us working from civil society or different international institutions or the public sector, let's work together on this, and let's look for unusual allies and make this work. It's a very valuable contribution to the anti-corruption agenda. Thank you.